I'm watching US Navy ships scrambling out of Bahrain right now, and I need you to understand something. This isn't a drill anymore. The American embassy in Israel just sent out an email that basically said, get out while you still can. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. Ambassador Mike Hucker didn't mince words. He told staff if they're leaving, they need to be on a plane today because commercial flights might not be running much longer. And here's where it gets complicated. While that email was going out, Iran was already launching dozens of ballistic missiles at American military bases across the Gulf. I'm talking about Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest US military facility in the entire Middle East, the headquarters of the US Navy's 5th Fleet in Bahrain, bases in the UAE, Kuwait, all of them under attack right now. One person is already dead in Abu Dhabi, killed by debris from an interceptor missile that shot down an Iranian projectile over the city. Think about that for a second. You're sitting in your home in Abu Dhabi and missile defense fragments fall through your roof. Wait, it gets worse. Qatar just shut down its entire airspace. The UAE followed. Kuwait, Bahrain, all of them closing their skies as missiles streak overhead. Air defense systems are firing constantly. Videos are circulating on social media showing US Navy facilities in Bahrain getting hit. Explosions lighting up the night sky over Doha. But here's what nobody's talking about. This morning, before any of this happened, the US and Israel launched what they're calling a preemptive strike on Iran. They hit Tehran, they hit Isfahan, Kar, Kermanshah, the multiple cities across Iran, and according to sources I'm seeing, they weren't just hitting military targets, they were going after Iran's leadership. Reports suggest they targeted the Supreme Leader residence in downtown Tehran. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. The Pentagon has been building up forces in the region for weeks. 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford, just deployed to the area. We were talking about more than a dozen warships, F-22 stealth fighters, aerial refueling tankers. This isn't a show of force. This is preparation for war. And then this happened. President Trump went on record hours ago saying this operation could result in regime change in Iran. He's talking about annihilation and elimination. Those are his words. Meanwhile, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is warning that any base that assists the US or Israel is now a legitimate target. This is the part that kept me up last night. 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. You know where that is. Right between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. If Iran decides to close that strait, and they absolutely have the capability, we're looking at an oil crisis that would make 1973 look like a minor inconvenience. Oil prices are already surging on just the fear of closure. But that's not even the real story. The real story is what happened in the 48 hours before these strikes. There were talks. Geneva indirect negotiations between the US and Iran mediated by Oman. Iranian Foreign Minister Abaisi called them positive and said they were making progress on a nuclear deal. The US said the same thing, and then less than 24 hours later this happened. Here's what the US won't tell you about these negotiations. Reports are coming in that Trump's entire justification for these strikes. His claim that Iran is close to developing missiles that could reach the United States is completely contradicted by US intelligence assessments. We're talking about the same intelligence agencies that brief the president every morning, telling him one thing and him saying something completely different to the American public. Now, what I'm about to show you changes everything. During his State of the Union address 3 days ago, Trump said Iran's missiles could soon reach the United States. But intelligence officials are leaking to reporters that this is false. Iran doesn't have intercontinental ballistic missile capability, and according to these assessments, they're not close to it. Wait, it gets worse. Special Envoy Steve Wheater went on national television last week, claiming Iran was probably a week away from having industrial-grade bomb-making material because their uranium enrichment was at 60%. 1 week, that's what he said. Then Secretary of State Marco Rubio turned around and said Iran is not enriching right now, and they're trying to get to the point where they ultimately can. So which is it? Are they a week away from a bomb, or are they not even enriching uranium? But here's where it gets really complicated. The US and Israel didn't just launch these strikes today. Back in June 2025, they conducted something called Operation Midnight Hammer. Trump referenced it in his speech today. He said they obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities at Ford and Isfahan. Those are deep underground enrichment sites built into mountains specifically to survive air strikes. Here's what nobody's asking. If the US already destroyed Iran's nuclear program 9 months ago, why are we launching another massive military operation now? What changed? Or more importantly, was the program actually destroyed? Or are we being told a very different story than what actually happened and then this happened? China issued evacuation orders for its citizens in Iran. Not a warning, not a recommendation, in order to get out immediately. When was the last time you saw China do that? They also told Chinese citizens in Israel to strengthen security precautions. China doesn't do this unless their intelligence tells them something catastrophic is about to unfold. This is the part that terrifies me. The Netherlands-based airline KLM already suspended all flights to Tel Aviv. Other carriers are routing around the entire region. The FAA is going to have to make a decision very soon about whether American carriers can fly anywhere near the Gulf states. And if they can't, you're looking at a massive disruption to international air travel. But that's not even the real problem. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps released a statement saying they launched the first wave of attacks. First wave, not a strike, not retaliation. First wave. That means more is coming. Here's what we're learning. Footage verified by multiple sources shows Iranian ballistic missiles hitting a logistics facility at Naval Support Activity Bahrain. That's where the Fifth Fleet operates from. The facility wasn't just damaged, it took a direct hit. Officials aren't releasing casualty figures yet, which usually means they're bad. In Qatar, witnesses reported seeing 3 ballistic missiles intercepted above Al-Awad. The Patriot defense system got them before impact, but just barely. Sources on the ground say aircraft were being evacuated from the base hours before the strikes, which means US Central Command knew this was coming. Now, what I'm about to tell you should shock you. The UAE intercepted multiple Iranian missiles, most of them, but not all. And here's the thing. The UAE has one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in the world. If Iranian missiles are getting through their defenses, they're getting through anyone's defenses. Wait, there's more. Kuwait reported explosions near areas hosting US Army Central. Jordan, which shares a border with Israel, intercepted 2 ballistic missiles that were targeting its territory. Explosions were heard in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. This isn't just hitting US bases. Iran is sending a message to every Gulf state. If you host American forces, you're a target. And here's what's really disturbing is Qatar condemned the Iranian strikes as a flagrant violation of national sovereignty. The UAE called it a dangerous escalation and a cowardly act. These are countries that have spent the last decade trying to maintain neutral relationships with both Washington and Tehran. They don't want to be involved in this war, but Iran just forced them to choose sides. But here's what nobody's talking about. US military personnel were already being quietly evacuated from always before these strikes happened. Documents reveal that hundreds of non-essential personnel were moved out of Qatar over the past week. The Pentagon knew Iran was going to retaliate. They knew exactly where those missiles were going to be aimed, and they let it happen anyway. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole narrative. Iran didn't just wake up this morning and decide to attack American bases. This has been building for months. After Operation Midnight Hammer last June, Iran spent 9 months rebuilding its missile arsenal. US intelligence knew this. Satellite imagery showed new missile production facilities going operational in January. Tehran wasn't hiding it. They were daring Washington to try again. Here's where it gets really twisted. The timing of these strikes right after positive talks in Geneva tells you everything you need to know about what's actually happening. Either the negotiations were never serious and both sides were just posturing, or someone on one side intentionally sabotaged them. Sources familiar with the talks told reporters that Iran was willing to compromise on uranium enrichment levels. They were discussing inspection protocols. The framework of a deal was taking shape. And then Israel launched strikes on Tan before the US could finalize anything. Wait, it gets worse. Trump said his objectives were freedom for the Iranian people and ensuring the country is safe. But in the same breath, he's talking about annihilating Iran's navy and eliminating the Revolutionary Guard. You can't have both. You can't claim you want freedom for people while threatening to destroy their country's entire military infrastructure. This is what's really happening. The Pentagon has contingency plans for Iran that have been updated constantly since 2003. We're not talking about limited strikes on nuclear facilities. We're talking about comprehensive plans to destroy Iran's entire military command structure, its naval forces, its air defenses, its missile production facilities, the works. And Trump just authorized the beginning of that campaign. But here's what changes everything. Iran has options the US doesn't want to talk about. They have proxy forces across the entire Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon with over 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel. Militias in Iraq that can hit US forces there. The southeast in Yemen who have already demonstrated they can strike targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Now, what I'm about to tell you should terrify you. If Iran decides to actually close the Strait of Hormuz, they don't even need to do it with naval forces. They can mine the strait. They can use shore-based anti-hex missiles. They can deploy submarines. The US Navy would have to conduct massive mine-sweeping operations while under constant attack just to keep the waterway open. And during all of that, the global oil shipments stop. Here's what nobody's asking. What happens when gas prices in the US hit $7.89 a gallon? Because that's what we're talking about. If Hormuz closes for even 2 weeks, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve can cover maybe 30 days of disruption. After that, you're looking at rationing. But that's not even the worst part. Iran has been preparing for this scenario for 20 years. They've built hardened and dispersed military assets specifically designed to survive American air strikes. They've created redundant command and control systems. They've trained their forces to operate independently if central command is destroyed. This isn't Iraq in 2003 where the whole military folded in 3 weeks. This is a country that fought an 8-year war with Iraq in the 1980s and still held out. They know how to take punishment and keep fighting. And then this happened. Iran's exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi released a video message calling on Iran's military to join the people and help bring about regime change. He promised immunity to security forces who lay down their weapons. Trump is clearly signaling that regime change is the goal here. But here's what's really complicated. The last time the US tried regime change in the Middle East, we got ISIS. We got a destabilized Iraq that's still struggling 20 years later. We got a refugee crisis that nearly broke Europe. And that was in a country with a third of Iran's population and a fraction of its military capability. This is the part that keeps me up at night. There is no scenario where this ends quickly and cleanly. Either Trump backs down, which seems unlikely given his rhetoric, or this escalates into a full-scale war involving multiple countries across the region. And if that happens, you're looking at economic consequences that make 2008 look mild. Here's what the US military isn't telling you. Those 2 carrier strike groups in the Gulf, the Abraham Lincoln and Gerald R. Ford, each one carries roughly 5,000 personnel. Each one has dozens of aircraft. They're billion-dollar targets floating in waters where Iran has been preparing to fight exactly this kind of battle for 2 decades. And they're sitting ducks. Now, what I'm about to show you changes how you need to think about this entire situation. Iran has invested heavily in what military strategists call asymmetric warfare capabilities. That's a fancy way of saying they can't match the US ship for ship or plane for plane. So, they've built weapons specifically designed to kill American carrier groups, anti-hip ballistic missiles, cruise missiles launched from coastal positions, swarms of fast attack boats, sea mines. These aren't theoretical threats. Iran has been testing and refining these systems for years. Wait, it gets worse. The US Navy hasn't fought a peer or near-peer naval engagement since World War II. Every conflict since then has been against adversaries with little to no naval capability. Iraq didn't have a navy. Afghanistan is landlocked. Libya's navy was a joke. But Iran has been specifically preparing to fight the US Navy in confined waters where American technological advantages are minimized. This is what nobody's talking about. And this is a big if, Iran manages to severely damage or sink a US aircraft carrier, the political fallout in Washington would be catastrophic. We're talking about thousands of American casualties in a single strike. The pressure for massive retaliation would be overwhelming. And that's exactly what would lead to the wider war everyone says they want to avoid. But here's where it gets really complicated. Israel is pushing for the US to completely destroy Iran's nuclear program and military infrastructure. They've been pushing for this for 15 years. They finally have an administration willing to do it. But the Pentagon has been very clear in internal assessments. This isn't a quick operation. Sources familiar with military planning say a comprehensive campaign against Iran would require sustained air strikes for weeks, possibly months. You'd need to hit hundreds of targets. Many of them are underground or hardened. Some would need multiple strikes to ensure destruction, and during all of that Iran would be hitting back. Now, what I'm about to tell you should change how you see Trump's rhetoric. When he talks about annihilation and elimination, he's not just trying to sound tough. Preparing the American public for a level of military action we haven't seen since the opening phases of the Iraq War in 2003, possibly bigger than that. But that's not even the real problem. The real problem is what happens after. Let's say the US succeeds. Let's say they destroy Iran's military, cause regime change, and a new government takes over. Who fills the power vacuum? The opposition groups are fractured. The exile community has been out of the country for decades. Iran has 90 million people and a complex society that doesn't fit neat political categories. Here's what we learned from Iraq and Libya. Destroying a government is easy. Building something stable afterwards is nearly impossible. And Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq, with a much more educated population and deeper regional ties. This is the part that terrifies me most. If Iran's government collapses, you're looking at potential chaos across the entire Middle East. Iran has influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza. All of those relationships, those proxy forces, those weapons supplies, what happens to them if Tehran loses control? Wait, there's more I need to tell you. Russia and China are watching this very closely. They're not going to militarily intervene on Iran's behalf. That would risk direct conflict with the US. But they'll provide diplomatic cover. They'll sell weapons. They'll help Iran evade sanctions. This could push Iran permanently into a Moscow-Beijing alignment that actually makes the situation worse long-term. And here's what's really disturbing. The economic impact of this conflict is going to hit regular Americans hard. We're already seeing oil prices spike. If this drags on for months, you're looking at inflation that could push the US economy into recession. The Federal Reserve would be forced to make impossible choices between controlling inflation and supporting economic growth. But here's the question nobody's asking. What's the endgame? Trump hasn't articulated what success actually looks like. Is it just destroying Iran's nuclear facilities? Is it regime change? Is it completely dismantling Iran's military? Because each of those goals requires a different level of commitment and comes with different risks. Now, here's what I'm watching for. The next 48 hours are critical. If Iran launches another wave of attacks, and they said this was just the first wave, the US will have to respond. Each action leads to a reaction, and pretty soon you're in a spiral that's very difficult to escape. Documents reveal that US intelligence assessed Iran would need to respond strongly to maintain credibility with its own population and its regional allies. They couldn't just take a hit and do nothing. So this retaliation, everyone saw it coming. The question is whether anyone has a plan to de-escalate before this turns into something much worse. And I'm not convinced they do. Where do you think this goes from here? Because I'm looking at the pieces on the board, and I don't see an easy way out of this. Let me know what I'm missing.